I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds, welcome to my horror house. Today we've got something a little bit special for you, especially if you're a fan of utterly bonkers Italian genre cinema from 1979. It's The Visitor. One of the glorious things about Italian cinema, especially from the 70s and 80s, is how unashamed they were at bandwagon jumping and ripping off hits, especially hits from Hollywood. And The Visitor is probably the absolute apex of this. The intent, as an interview with the scriptwriter on the Arrow Blu-ray that I watched will attest to, the intent was to rip off The Exorcist. I mean, it was pitched to him literally like that. We want to rip off The Exorcist, but we don't want it to look like a rip-off of The Exorcist. But it is so much more like a stew where a novice chef is just throwing in extra ingredients. Oh, I wonder if this will go with it. Oh, I'll put in a little bit of this. The Visitor riffs on The Exorcist, The Omen, or more specifically, Damien Omen 2. There's a little bit of Rosemary's Baby. There's some of Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. There's a touch of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and even a little soupçon of Star Wars. Have I whet your appetite? If you're a fan already of Italian genre cinema from the period, there is so much to love in The Visitor. If you've always sort of scratched your head and thought it's all a little bit impenetrable and weird, but want to maybe try and get into this area of cinema, I think The Visitor is actually a really good ground level introduction to Italian genre cinema at the time. Because one thing's for absolutely certain, while an awful lot of these films do rip off existing movies, especially from Hollywood, it's always filtered through an artistic lens and Italian sensibility. So that even though you know the ingredients that have gone into making, say, The Visitor, all the films I've just mentioned, you won't be able to predict what form they will come out in. One of the things I absolutely adore about Italian genre cinema, especially gialli, is that you can stick on a film. If the Visitor had been made in Hollywood, you could stick that film on and you could have a pretty good idea how it would play out. You know, the hero's journey, good versus evil. You stick in an Italian gialli movie, you have absolutely no idea how that movie's going to play out, whether the killer is even going to be supernatural or human. You watch The Visitor, and even though you understand all of the different moving parts, they're fitted together in such a weird and unique way, you absolutely won't be able to predict what comes next, one scene to the next, let alone how all this is going to play out. But why I think The Visitor would be a good introduction to this area of cinema is, even though an awful lot of the reviews I've read for it say that it's completely nonsensical, utterly bewildering and discombobulating, the plot for The Visitor is actually relatively straightforward, and even better for those hoping to get a foothold in this wonderful country's wonderful cinematic art. You have a character at the start of the movie who explains the entire thing to you, and then what happens is that scenario being played out. It just so happens that the scenario is particularly insane. I mean, it's out there. Let me give you a taster. The film opens on an alien planet, and a figure in dark approaches a figure in brown. An elderly man who looks very much like Obi-Wan Kenobi, Alec Guinness, dressed as a Jedi, being approached by someone in dark robes who looks very much like a Sith. I don't think that was a coincidence. No dialogue, all imagery, good versus evil in a standoff for the battle to come, and then that's over with. Then you get Franco Nero of Django fame as Jesus, explaining to a bunch of bald kids that a long, long time ago, an alien space criminal called Zatine escaped imprisonment and fled across the galaxy and ran ultimately to hide on Earth. And the person who had captured Zatin was called Yahweh, and Yahweh went to chase him. So we're already talking about God and Zatin, Satan, being aliens. Zatin was defeated, but not before he had procreated with a bunch of human women, and so now Yahweh, anytime Zatin's genetic code of evil springs up, Yahweh would return to Earth and try and uproot that evil before it spreads. Cut to Atlanta in the then modern day of the movie, and we follow an 8-year-old girl called Katie, who is currently Zatin's only descendant, and her mother, we learn, of all that generation on Earth, has the only womb that is capable of producing Zatin's genetic progeny. So she is under a lot of pressure. Rosemary's baby like to have another child, whilst Katie is coming into her Damien Antichrist type powers. So there's the Omen element of it, and then you've got the Yahweh figure who's come to Earth to try and stop her, and there's lots of birds, and there's an exploding basketball, and there are hawk attacks and car crashes. There's a fight on an ice rink. It's just a load of gonzo bonkers stuff that doesn't flow like your normal sanitized Hollywood movie, and it's all the more luscious and gorgeous for it. I absolutely understand why it was slated at the time, and probably rightfully slated. We're presented with this film and it doesn't make sense in the traditional narrative structure, but essentially everything that we've been shown is the unfolding of the setup that Jesus gave us at the start of the movie. And if you're not going to listen to Jesus, then you're not going to understand the movie. Oh, and God has a theme tune in The Visitor. It's a brilliant theme tune, and I'm going to link to it below. I really urge you to go and listen to it. It's a wonderful piece of bombastic music. I absolutely adore the fact that God's theme tune sort of busts out probably about 4, maybe even 5 times during the movie. Every single time it's while that character is doing pretty much nothing, either just standing around, walking down a corridor, walking down a flight of steps. You get this wonderful ba-dam, ba-da-ba-da, ba-da, bam, 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 which would seem ridiculous if but Quentin Tarantino has sort of folded that back into our popular current consciousness by putting real kick-ass music in things like Kill Bill over sequences where very little, if not nothing, happens. And he gets it from European movies like this. It's a little touch that I absolutely adore, but the theme tune from The Visitor I really want on a little recording device so that I can play it at inopportune moments, like when I'm making a cup of tea, I want that theme music. When I'm going upstairs to bed, I want that theme music. So for all that the film and the script, which is a script that I think was made by originally an Italian-American screenwriter from an idea that the producer had, but then rewritten by the director. I think there was a lot of meddling, and it sounds like behind the scenes there were a lot of people pulling in a lot of different directions. So the film does seem an awful like a patchwork of scenes. But that's fine, because every single scene looks, as you would expect from Italian cinema, it looks gorgeous. It feels wonderful. If you can just get into the vibe of the movie and go with it, you will understand an awful lot about why Italian genre cinema from the 70s and 80s works. And if you dig it, there is a world of movies out there for you to enjoy. And I really did dig it. The movie looks gorgeous. The camera work is superb for what essentially now is a sort of cult B-movie fan favourite. The cameras restless, always coming at us from strange angles, finding interesting ways to frame scenes and introduce us to scenes. The location scout, on location it was shot in Atlanta and then on soundstage in Rome, but the Atlanta location scout did an absolutely sterling job. All the buildings look visually interesting, visually arresting, and they're shot to bring out all of their best features. I mean, for all that you can laugh at the narrative gear crunches, the technicalities of the way the film has been put together and the way it looks are superlative. And honestly, where else are you going to see essentially God and the devil playing Pong? Whilst films of this ilk at the time might well have been, and usually were, laughed out of town, with enough time and distance, we're able to look back at these artifacts and honestly sometimes think, how on earth did this get made? But also think, well, thank God there was a time when this did get made, and we've now got gorgeous, luscious Blu-rays of it, because no one is ever going to make a movie like this again. It's one of the things I adore, especially about Italian genre cinema. No one's ever going to make movies like that again. And just the strange left field sensibilities that most of these pieces of art come from, they're just a joy. And when else are you going to see a cast like this in a movie like this? Because let me tell you about the cast. The Yahweh character is played by legendary film director John Huston. He's sort of the Jedi figure I mentioned at the start, the Alec Guinness sort of Obi-Wan figure. He's great in this. Glenn Ford plays the police detective who's sort of trying to investigate what's going on. Sam Peckinpah has a cameo as a doctor, for crying out loud. Shelley Winters is in it as a bizarre sort of housekeeper who seems to be in a world of her own, in a role that I can only assume had a scene or two cut, because she doesn't seem to do much bar sort of dust, sing to herself, and then at the end of the movie slap the Antichrist round the face. Lance Henriksen is there as the erstwhile stepfather of Katie, the young devil child. A young Lance Henriksen. Think of him how he was around the time of Damien Omen 2, which was a year earlier, and you're pretty much on the nose with that. Franco Nero, as I mentioned earlier, has a brief cameo at the start and the end of the movie as a character not called Jesus, but I like to think of him as Space Jesus. And really stand out, names that you won't necessarily recognise. Joanna Nail plays Barbara Collins, the Katie's mother, the devil's mother, in essence. She has the sort of Rosemary from Rosemary's Baby type role in this. She's got a real Margot Robbie sort of energy to her, eminently watchable. And the jewel in the crown amongst all of these Hollywood royalty names is Paige Connor, who plays young Katie. Bring to mind Linda Blair as she was in The Exorcist. You've got almost her doppelganger in this. As I say, the intention to rip off is not well hidden, and I don't think it's ever intended to be well hidden. You liked Exorcist? You like the little girl in Exorcist? Well, here's a little girl who's almost exactly the same as that, but she knocks it out of the park. As if Linda Blair were playing Damien in The Omen, you'd get Paige Connor, and she really is a little shit of an 8-year-old, and you really want her to get her comeuppance. Great music, great cinematography, great direction, actually pretty great acting, and a script that is so bonkers that they just seem to want to throw every reference they can at you all the way through it, but sort of blended through that Italian sensibility, so that the smoothie that you get at the end, for me at least, goes down oh so well. So if you want to see Glenn Ford attacked by a falcon, John Huston as Obi-Wan Kenobi / Father Merrin from The Exorcist, if you want to see Franco Nero as Space Jesus and God and the Devil playing Pong on a projector screen, the only place you're going to find it is The Visitor.